Good morning, students. Today, pen lecture number 3, we are going to study again the William Wordsworth's concept of poetic diction. The very background, very history of the concept of poetic diction's establishment or creation is that the very decision of William Wordsworth to choose the language of lower and middle class people in the poetry. One, which he mentions into the preface to the lyrical ballad, first edition. What he mentions in the preface to lyrical ballads, first edition, he mentions very well that because being a nature, a romantic and common man, means from the common man, poet, common man's life, nature and romantic, this William Wordsworth want to represent every sector of the society. But he has seen that since the beginning of the literature, only the high class people, aristocratic people, kings, queens are the center of literature, though it may be poetry, prose or novel and play. So for the first time, he decides to choose, enter, represent the life of common man. Means to change the trend of representation of only one class in literature. And so he mentions that his object, why he want to enter, why he want to change the trend, why he want to oppose the traditional patterns of writing in general and classical poetries, neoclassical poetries, poetries of the time of Alexander Pope in particular, is that he says his object, what is his object, main उद्देश्य क्या है, his object is in adopting or adaptation, in adopting a simpler diction, adapting simpler diction means simple patterns, simple language, simple style of poetry. In adopting simple diction for his poems, or poetries, was merely assertion how for the language, how for the language of conversation, in the middle or of the middle, in the middle or lower, मध्यम वर्ग किंवा गरीब वर्ग, classes of society, was adopted to the purposes of poetic purpose, was adopted to the purpose of poetic pleasure. Look at this, what Wordsworth has said at the very preface to the Lyrical Ballads, first edition of 1798. So, when you look at this, you will come to know that the language which he chooses for the purpose of poetic pleasures, that the language is very important, because according to him, the very object which he mentions, that in adopting simple diction for his poems is, because look at this object, simple diction for his poems was merely assertions, what to assert that the language of conversation of lower and middle class of people is totally away from the language of poetry. So, his very purpose, that which he mentions into the preface to Lyrical Ballad, that he wants to add the very language of lower and middle class into the poetry, that is his main object. So he says, in adopting simple diction for his poems was merely assertions include how for the language of conversation in the middle or lower classes of society was adopted to the purpose of poetic pleasure. Because he says, when you want to write the poetries and the poetries which give pleasure to the readers, you must have to include, assert the language of lower and middle class of society people, because such a language is very away from the language of poetry. So his very object, when he mentions in the preface to Lyrical Ballad, the neoclassical poets, classical poets, the earlier poets, traditional poets have attacked on his very purpose of, very object of choosing the language of lower and middle class. So, William Wordsworth at that time became very much angry by the very attack for the language of lower and middle class, because the established poets, classical poets, only want to glory, praise, represent, highlight the one class, high class. So, the William Wordsworth very object was totally denied, attacked how? Mercilessly attacked at that time. William Wordsworth put his mind, he made up of his mind that the very attack he want to deny, and the very attack he keep in mind and says that anyhow he decides to choose the language of these low and middle class people. So he don't care, he totally ignore the attack, and preface to Lyrical Ballads, preface to Lyrical Ballads, second edition of 1800, means second edition of 1800, he mentions his, initially mentions his object, but now he includes his principal object. Why he want to, principal means mainly involve this, that is very well clear. His principal object, now he said the same object as his principal object in his poems about the selection or choosing of the very language of lower and middle classes. He very well, because I am repeating the same what I have said in the second language. Now the principal object, he says, number one, just you the whole pattern, whole sentence, whole para, you can also involve, divide into the number also for your memory, for your remembrance, for your detailed study and practice. He says, principal object was to choose incidents and situations. Incidents and situations from common life. From common life. Common life means life of lower and middle class people. This is one. The very principal object of William Wordsworth behind the writing of concept of poetic diction, which he very well mentions into the preface to Lyrical Ballad, second edition of 1800, he explains his principal object. Means his very object become the principal object of his writing after the attack of the new classical, traditional, established poets. He says the principal object was to choose or select incidents and situations. Look at this word. You will be asked or you will be repeating often and often. Incidents and situations. Ghatana and Paristhiti, the lower and middle class people live from common life was. Why? From common life, I am to second and to relate or describe them throughout or as far as throughout completely the incidents and situations of lower and middle classes people is to relate or describe them in the poetry throughout or as far as possible or as far as possible. If not completely, then take as far as possible. जेवढे शक्य होईल तेवढे घ्या as far as possible in a selection of language. In a selection of language. When you choose the language of the lower and middle class, you directly take whole incidents and situations of lower class and middle class people. If there is a limitation of taking whole incident and situations at that time, Wordsworth says take as far as possible in a selection of language, really used by men. Really used by men means really used by men. Really used by the lower and middle class men, he says. Because the very idea, very purpose of William Wordsworth is behind the preface to the Lyrical Ballads writing and the writing of or highlighting the concept of poetic diction for the first time is that the common lower middle class man, their life, their incidents, their language, situations must be involved in the literature in general, poetry in particular. Because the only domination of high class people, their pompous show, their extravagance couldn't bring pleasure to the readers. That's the very reality that you want to say. Further, he says, really used by men at the same time, and he says, at the same time, to throw over them, to throw over them. Over them is because when you select the language of lower and middle class people, William Wordsworth knows that the language of these lower and middle class people is very much rustic, pastoral, because these people are illiterate people, pastorate people, rustic people, totally away from this civilized world. So he says when you take each and every selection of the language throughout as far as possible, at that time he says you just threw over them certain color of imagination. Certain color of imagination means little modification, filtration is required. Means at the same time when you select the language, you throw over them, over the language, certain or the people's incident and situations, you certain color of imagination whereby ordinary things, whereby means then what will happen? Whereby means whereby or then ordinary means this simple man's language, incident, situations, very selection when we choose, because their language, their incident and situation are ordinary, common, ignorable. But when you select everything and throw over them a certain color of imagination, because poets' work is to imagine. Whatever they found little, they make the imaginary concepts on it and make it more ideal, more pleasurable, more universal, and more and more. So it's the duty of the poet is to imagine and act. So color of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual way. To the mind in an unuseful way or unuseful way. So when you look at this pattern, you will come to know what this William Wordsworth want to say through this. So, my dear friends, Wordsworth is a well-known poet, reformer, trendsetter, romantic as well nature poet, and he has changed the scenario of poetry through his writing, through his new way of selection of the language in the poetry. Because whenever you go through the poetry is like solitary for daffodils, Lucy poems, you will come to know that in each and every language of poetry he has presented. Because when you look at his well-known poem, Solitary Reaper, in that he represents, centers, highlights the very ordinary woman who was alone in the field, was singing a song, reaping a grains, dhanne kapat hai, and at the same time binding the grains. Means singing, reaping, binding means, and at the same time her song was so enchanting, her voice was so good, nice, than the nightingale and cuckoo, he says. So, such a representation of common and ordinary men, their incident and situations, the very selection of the language when we choose throughout or as far as possible in a selection of language, But when we collect their incidents, situations, their language, only the poet has to throw certain light of color of imagination. Then what will happen? The very common and lower middle class men's incidents, situations, language throughout or as per possible when we choose for the poetry, then what will happen? Finally, when we save it, give a final touch by adding the color of imagination, then what will happen? The ordinary things, because the ordinary people's language, which is called the ordinary things of the common man's life, becomes the extraordinary by adding the color of imagination, which is the duty of the poet. Ordinary thing should be presented, highlighted, shown in the literature or through poetry to the mind in an unusual way. Because when the readers think about it, read about it, his mind feel that this is the very extraordinary language the poet has used. The poet has used the very language in an unusual way. Usual, opposite unusual. Usual means consistently since along the poet have using the same pattern. But unusual means for the first time, the reader will definitely say that the pattern that Wordsworth had chosen, the writers had chosen in their poetry was totally unique, totally ideal, and totally the well-known creation. So, the very purpose of this language that these poets use is ideal. So, dear friends, the very pattern of poetry, the pattern of William Wordsworth's concept of poetic diction is unique. So when you will come to know the very pattern of William Wordsworth writing, when you read and go through his poetries, Lucy poems which are 5 in number, totally represent the nature and the ordinary girl in the midst of the nature. So I'll tell you reference with each and every poetry of William Wordsworth is a unique creation. So, even prelude as well. There are so many poets. Some poetry you might have studied at compulsory English. In compulsory English, at BA first year or secondary level. So, such poetries, such concept of poetic diction of William Wordsworth is unique, really useful, and really the experiment which William Wordsworth has done by the attack of the neoclassical traditional established poet, he doesn't care for that, and he has established his main object, principal object, and that very object becomes successful, and the very pattern that he used through his poetry that become unuseful one. Dear friends, with this I stop here. In the next lecture, we will discuss its further part. Thank you very much.